Hi, and thanks for being here. I'm Dr. Larry Cavanaugh. We're going to be talking about the birth of Christ, which involves the Star of Bethlehem and also involves the death of Herod, which involves a lunar eclipse. Both of these subjects have fascinated astronomers for a long time. In this presentation, I'll be using a computer program called Starry Night, which recreates what happened in the sky at any point in time and from any place on Earth. It's kind of good, and it's nothing that they had at the time of Christ, that's for sure. So we may get some answers, but bear in mind, this is all conjecture. So let's get to it and let's start conjecturing. So here we are, three wise men, actually astrologers, from somewhere in the East, maybe Persia, maybe Babylon, and they saw this phenomenal object in the sky, which caused them to drop everything and move to Jerusalem to meet with the king there, King Herod. And let's see what the Bible says about that. This is from St. Matthew, but this is as far back to the original as we can get, from the Latin Vulgate that was prepared by St. Jerome, a literal translation of Matthew chapter 2, the beginning. When Jesus therefore was born in Bethlehem of Judah in the days of King Herod, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and we are come to adore him. And King Herod, hearing this, was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where Christ should be born. But they said to him, Bethlehem of Judah, for so it is written by the prophet, this would have been the prophet Micah, And thou, Bethlehem, the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come forth the captain that shall rule my people Israel. Okay, so they saw a star. They called it a star. As an astronomer, what could this be? Let's think of the possibilities. Think they saw a supernova? Maybe they saw a comet? Maybe they saw a conjunction of planets? Anything else? Modern astronomy can only go so far. We can't get supernatural, but those are the possibilities. What about a supernova? Could it be that the wise men saw a supernova? We can say some stuff about supernovas. For one thing, here is a remnant of a supernova that was spotted in 185 AD. Because when a star explodes, it doesn't make just a bright spot in the sky. It expands plasma, and that plasma leaves a trail which can be seen hundreds and even thousands of years later. So we know that a supernova exploded in 185 AD. We can say that for sure. There's a picture of it. Here's a picture of the remnant of a supernova that exploded in 1054 AD. This is a famous one. This is the Crab Nebula in the constellation of Taurus. Here's the remnant of a supernova that happened in 1572. It was spotted by the famous astronomer Tycho Brahe, and it's in the constellation Cassiopeia, and that's a modern picture of it. By the way, it said that Queen Elizabeth I actually saw that supernova. And this is one that exploded very recently, relative to astronomical time, in 1987, and close by in our neighboring dwarf galaxy, the Large Magellanic Cloud, and this is the remnant of it. Here is the remnant of something that exploded 12,000 years ago. So what I'm saying is that if there's a supernova, it leaves a remnant in the sky. And there are, in fact, about 100 different objects that have been identified as supernova remnants, and you can tell where they are, where they happened, and how long ago they happened. And I have to tell you, there is no supernova remnant that can be remotely identified within hundreds of years of something that would have been seen in Jerusalem. The best one was the first one that I showed you, that was 185 AD. So we can say with almost certainty that whatever the wise men saw, it was not a supernova. Let's try the next possibility. Possibility. Comet? Could they have seen a comet? Well, comets look like this. This is a picture of an actual comet. This is a picture of a comet that everybody in North America saw in 1997. It was the best comet we've had in maybe 100 years, even better than Comet Halley. This was Comet Hale-Bopp, and I took this picture myself with a 35mm camera and no special lens, right near where I live in Louisa, Virginia. This is the same comet as it passed over my house. Again, that's an unretouched photograph from just an ordinary 35mm camera. What can I say about a comet? Well, if it happened, everybody saw it. And if it happened, it certainly did not look like a star. It looked like a thing with a big trail behind it. And in fact, if you lived back in those days, you did not take the appearance of a comet as indicating anything good and wonderful and supernatural. In fact, back in those days, comets were considered to be bad signs, signs of impending disaster. So I've got to say, the Star of Bethlehem, whatever it was also not a comet. Well, third possibility, a conjunction of planets. That means that two objects come together, and by coming together, they create a brighter light. Now, of all the objects in the sky, the sun is the brightest, the moon is the next brightest, but the next two brightest objects in the sky are the two planets Venus and Jupiter. And since they're planets, and since their orbits are so predictable, modern computers can get absolutely precise as to where the planets were at any time and at any point on Earth. So let's travel back to the east, somewhere around Persia or Babylon in 3 BC, specifically in August. And if you woke up early in the morning, this is what you would have seen. Look at this carefully. The sun would have been just about to arise. It would have been 4:41 in the morning. This is the 9th of August, 3 BC, using the Gregorian calendar. And the two arrows I have pointing are to Venus and Jupiter. Again, our two brightest objects after the sun and the moon, and they're pretty close together. That was August 9th. One day later, same time, August 10th, they were even closer together. August 11th, they were practically touching. And on August 12th, they did touch. So if the two brightest planets come together so close that they appear to be just one object and the naked eye could not tell the difference, you might be inclined to say, that is a brand new star. That is exciting. That does not happen very often. Now that happened on the 12th of August, 3 BC. And that could have been the thing that got the Magi excited. Several days later, after this period, Jupiter and Venus would have spread out again. But the Magi would have had enough information from this to make their trip to visit King Herod, the biggest king in the area. And 10 months later, looking in the evening sky, guess what? Same two planets came together again. And that is very rare. So here we are in June of 2 BC, and it's evening, 8 o'clock in the evening, and here again we see Jupiter and Venus. You see them in the center of the picture on the 14th of June. On the 15th of June, even closer. On the 16th of June, practically touching, and on the 17th of June, actually touching. Forming again something even more exciting because of the background sky than the one that they saw 10 months ago. This could have been the star that led the Magi from Herod to Bethlehem and could have hovered over the place where Jesus was. Maybe. It's all conjecture, remember. Now, I said that was a conjunction of Jupiter and Venus, and that's what those planets were called at the time. This was Roman days. And what did Rome think about Jupiter and Venus? That was the biggest. Jupiter was the main god in their Roman mythology. And Venus was the beauty queen of Roman mythology. So, if you're a Roman and if you believe in mythology, and of course we've got some astrologers to help you out, you're seeing the big god and the big goddess coming together. And what do? Maybe they signal or create the birth of a new king. That would be the mythology of it. Getting back to the Latin Vulgate, what actually happened? When the wise men saw Herod, privately calling the wise men, learned diligently of them of the time that the star appeared to them. And sending them into Bethlehem, he said, "Go and diligently inquire after the child, and when you have found him, bring me word again, that I also may come and adore him." And the wise men, who, having heard the king, went their way. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east in August went before them, now in June, until it came and stood over where the child was. And seeing the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And entering the house, they found the child with Mary his mother, and falling down they adored him. And opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having received an answer in sleep that they should not return to Herod, they went back another way into their country. Now we said there was a prophecy about why they would have gone to Bethlehem. If you pick up your Old Testament and look at the prophet Micah, chapter 5, verse 2, you will find there's the prophecy from the prophet Micah. "But you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, who are the one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days." So no surprise that they would have gone to Bethlehem. So that's the one thing where the coming together of the stars, the location of where Jesus was born, and the prophecy come together. Now I want to talk about the conjunction. Don't read everything on this chart, but this is a chart of all of the occultations and one conjunction of Jupiter by Venus over the period of over 2,000 years, from 3 BC to 2123 AD, as calculated by modern computers. How many times do Venus and Jupiter come together that close? This many times. That's all. That's only about a dozen times in 2,000 years. But wait, there's more. The two close to encounters that we saw on the 3 BC and 2 BC were just less than one year apart. Look at all the others. It's a 100-year or 200-year separation between events where Jupiter and Venus come together. But from 3 BC up through the next to the past the year 2000, that's the only time when those two planets would have come together that close twice in 1 year. That's got to get your attention, whether you're a magi or whether you're a modern astronomer. Anyway, that's what happened. Now, let's think about some timing here. How old was Jesus when the Magi came to visit him? Well, they saw his star in the east in August. Then they had to go visit Herod, and then the star appeared the next time. So it's quite likely that by the time the Magi came to visit Jesus, Jesus may have been about a year old. And that means that Herod didn't know about Jesus for the first year, because the Magi couldn't have gotten there to tell him about what they saw. And this gave plenty enough time for the other events that occurred in the early life of Jesus to have happened. Remember, he needed to be circumcised, presented at the temple. Simeon would have had to have seen him in the temple and taken him into his arms. and there was time for the shepherds to come and visit him. So all of that could have very easily happened before even the Magi came. Now we also have the story that Herod, after the Magi did not come back to see him and tell him exactly where he could find Jesus, enraged, ordered a massacre of young boys in Bethlehem, everybody 2 years old and younger. And the idea was that Herod was afraid that this newborn king would usurp his throne and become king in his place. Going to say a little bit more about that later. However, that would have meant that by the time Herod ordered the massacre of the young boys in Bethlehem and the Holy Family took flight into Egypt, Jesus could have been more than a year, maybe 2 years old. What about this flight into Egypt? Somebody will say that Matthew's Gospel is the only book of the Bible that talks about that, or that even mentions the death of all the boys in Bethlehem from 2 years and younger. And in fact, I have to say there are some historians who have advocated the idea that this massacre of young children in Bethlehem did not actually take place. Well, it's going to be kind of hard to prove one way or the other from good documentation, but I should say that there are at least 2 other important books, not in the Bible, but the Apocrypha of the New Testament, which are books that almost made it to the Bible, but were not taken in to the formal Bible for various reasons, that also tell the story of Herod and the death of the innocents in Bethlehem. These 2 books, there are at least 2. One of them is called the Proto-Vangelium, or Infancy Gospel of James, and the other is the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. You can go to Google or go to the internet and look up both of them and read their stories, and you can see why they're not quite good enough to have made it into the Gospel, into the Bible. They're not quite up to the caliber of the Gospel of Matthew, but they do tell the same story. Now let's also say this flight into Egypt. Let's take a look at this map here and get the places involved. First of all, Jerusalem, pointed out by the arrow there, which is in Judea, which was the center of the Hebrews at the time, which is where the great temple was located, and Bethlehem are quite close together. Bethlehem is only 5 or 6 miles away from Jerusalem, so that if Jesus was born in Bethlehem and then they needed to make a trip to Jerusalem for the circumcision and for the presentation in the temple, that was not a very difficult trip. For the flight into Egypt, from Bethlehem, you go south into Egypt. That's a little bit longer than the trip to Jerusalem, but we're told that the road from Bethlehem to Egypt was not too bad to travel, so it was a reasonable place to escape to. However, when the Holy Family came out of Egypt sometime later, they traveled up to Nazareth, where they later established their residence and where Jesus grew up as a young child. Look how far away Nazareth is from Egypt. It's quite a distance. You're looking at about 100 miles or more. Why go so far as to Nazareth? Well, again, Herod, the successor to the Herod that's known as Herod the Great, was his grandson, Herod Archelaus, who was a really nasty guy. In fact, as we're going to see in a little bit, it could have been Herod Archelaus who was instrumental in ordering the death of those little kids in Bethlehem, and he was to be avoided. So it's quite possible that the Holy Family decided, let's go to Nazareth, which is outside the realm of Herod Archelaus, but it is inside the realm of Herod Antipas, who's going to appear later in history as the one who the older Jesus goes to and who tries to execute him, but that's another story. The return from Egypt after the Holy Family felt that it was safe to return from Egypt was also something that was prophesied and noted by Matthew in his Gospel. Fulfillment of the prophet Hosea, might be pronounced Hosea. When Israel was a child, I loved him, but out of Egypt I called my son. Historians, again, some have interpreted that as having a different interpretation, but Matthew takes that as a prophecy that the Messiah will come out of Egypt. Now let's talk about Herod, who possibly is the one who ordered the death of the young children in Bethlehem and who wanted to kill Jesus. Why do I say possibly? Well, first of all, this Herod is called Herod the Great, but his successors, grandchildren and others, at least 3 of them also took the name Herod. Herod Archelaus, Herod Antipas, Herod Philip. And the timing of the birth of Jesus and the death of Herod was such that Herod the Great may have actually already died by the time Jesus was born. And when the Magi visited Herod, it might have been Herod Archelaus that they spoke with. Alternatively, Herod might have still been alive, but very ill, in which case it still might have been Herod Archelaus that the Magi spoke with, because in the last days of Herod the Great's realm, Herod Archelaus actually had the authority and was, in many cases, ruling in place of Herod the Great. These are things that historians have some certain amount of disagreement over. So it might be interesting to know just when did Herod die, and was it before or after the birth of Christ, and does this have anything to do with the birth of Christ? The best historian we have on this subject from back in those days was a fellow named Titus Flavius Josephus, a historian, who gave several ways to calculate when Herod died. But the key thing that he said that gets us astronomers interested is that when Herod died, it was after a lunar eclipse and before the start of Passover, which of course makes us go back and say, well, around this time, can we find some lunar eclipses that occurred just a little bit before Passover? There are 3 identified lunar eclipses which might be the ticket here. One was a lunar eclipse in March 23rd, 5 BC, which was a very strong total eclipse. The only problem with it is that it occurred 2 days after the start of Passover. Next one, March 13th in 4 BC, there was a partial eclipse, lunar eclipse, seen at 2:37 in the morning. This occurred about 29 days before the start of Passover and could have been the eclipse that Josephus had in mind. But it wasn't a terrific eclipse. On January 10th of 1 BC, there was a really good, spectacular total lunar eclipse that was maxed out at 1:04 a.m. In the morning in Jerusalem, and that was about 87 days before the start of Passover. If that's the one that Josephus was talking about, then that fits right in with the birth of Christ and would say that Herod was in fact still alive at when the Magi visited, although he did mention that they were very sick. And by the way, down at the bottom there, how did I know that Passover was those days? There's a calculator on the website, and that's how you can find it. And that's not the only calculator. Let's take a look now at the eclipses that we were just speaking about. First, here's the one from 5 BC, March 23rd, a total lunar eclipse. You can see that the moon gets very dark, And this would qualify as the one that Josephus was talking about, except that this eclipse occurred 2 days after the start of Passover. By the way, time is being speeded up by a factor of 900, so that 1 hour passes in 4 seconds on this. Here's the next one. This is the partial lunar eclipse that occurred in 4 BC, and you can see the moon does not get totally dark. That's because it's a partial eclipse. The timing of this one is okay, but it's not a spectacular eclipse. So that's number 2. Now let's see if we can move it to the next one. Here is the January 10th eclipse, and this is also a total eclipse. As you can see, as compared to the previous one, the moon is going to get essentially completely dark. The penumbra of the shadow of the earth covers the moon completely, and greatest darkness at 1:04 a.m. and that's 87 days before Passover. So that's a potential qualifier. If that's the one that Josephus was talking about, then a lot of other things work out. Here is Herod's pedigree. Herod the Great is the one that most people talk about. He did the most, and he had 3 grandchildren that eventually took over at least part of the kingship that he established. Herod Antipas, which one of the arrows is pointing to, became the ruler of Galilee and ultimately was the one who tried to sentence the adult Jesus to death before sending him to Pilate. To the left of him, of that arrow, is Archelaus, another grandchild of Herod the Great, who may have been the one ruling for Herod in the last year or two of Herod's life, and who may have been the one who ordered the massacre of the children. Then there's Philip, also known as Herod Philip, who, by the way, Tetrarch of Iturea, was actually the father of Salome, the one who asked for the head of John the Baptist. Let's summarize what was said in the form of a timeline. This is conjecture. It might fit, but if all this works out, it fits the facts. So we begin about August 12, 3 BC. Jesus is born, somewhere close to there. And the Magi from Persia, Babylon, Assyria see the new bright star in the sky, which might be a conjunction of the planets Jupiter and Venus. About 8 days later, on August 20th, Jesus and Mary and Joseph would travel to Jerusalem, just a short distance, where Jesus would be presented in the temple. He would be circumcised, and he would meet and be greeted by Simeon, who held him and blessed him, because Simeon was the one who had the prophecy that said that he would not die until he saw the Messiah. Later in that month, after the presentation, Joseph and Mary returned to Bethlehem, where they stay for essentially the next year. That's time enough for the shepherds to come and visit them, and other people as well. Then it's not until April or May of the following year that the Magi will go to Jerusalem and meet with Herod. Again, which Herod, I'm not sure. Maybe Herod the Great. If Herod the Great may be already dead, then Herod Archelaus is the one that they would meet with. Or if Herod is still alive, he was probably very sick, and they would still have met with Archelaus. They would then have been sent on their merry way to go find the child in Bethlehem. And about June 17th, in 2 BC, the Magi saw the second appearance of the star, and that's what guided them to the place where Jesus was, about June 17th. Then, sometime after that, the Magi do not follow Herod's request to come and tell them where the child is, and so Herod, being deceived, in a rage, orders the death of all the boys 2 years old or younger than that in Jerusalem. At that point, Jesus would be maybe about a year old. Could be a little bit more, a little bit less. But it would not be long after that that the soldiers come and start slaughtering the children, and the Holy Family flee to Egypt. So, between about January and April of 1 BC, Herod the Great would die. That's assuming that it's after that January 10th lunar eclipse and before the start of Passover. Don't know that news traveled very rapidly in those days, but eventually the news would have reached Egypt that Herod was dead, and the Holy Family would feel that it was safe to leave Egypt and go to Nazareth. At this point, Jesus would be at least 2 years old, maybe older than that. And they go all the way to Nazareth instead of stopping anywhere along the way, because Archelaus is in charge in the intervening region, and they don't want anything to do with Archelaus. But in Nazareth, you can be sure Jesus had a happy childhood. And I hope you're having a happy day. And thanks again for watching. And it's been a pleasure to have given you this presentation.